Hello, and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm your host, Spirit, and today we'll be talking about something a little different. In celebration of Pride Month, I've decided that I would talk about making LGBT characters, take a look at some examples, and share some of my own experiences with you guys. So what does it take to make a character who's LGBT? Well, there's a few main points that you should keep in mind. Number 1. Being LGBT does not define a character. Something I've seen often when people create characters who are LGBT is that their only character trait is that they have a different sexuality than the majority of the population. I've seen this more often in secondary characters. Usually when people are learning how to write, it's difficult to incorporate diversity, especially when they may not be as familiar with the topic. Unfortunately, when it comes to working with minorities, a poor knowledge of a topic can end up reflecting in your overall quality of work and can be both offensive to the minority it's representing and the audience who's observing your work. This actually leads to our next point. Number 2. Keep in mind stereotypes. Now notice that I didn't say avoid stereotypes. Sadly, while there are a lot of negative stereotypes that have come with the LGBT community, there are also a lot of positive aspects that are common in the LGBT community. For instance, something that I've noticed is that, at least in my particular group, we're very close friends. While you could partially attribute that to the fact that there's so few of us, I feel like being around other people with similar lives and problems can actually benefit you when it comes to figuring out your sexuality. When you're working with LGBT characters, it's important to keep in mind what's simply a stereotype versus what's actually true. Even if you're in the LGBT community, I would highly recommend doing some research if you're working with an aspect that you yourself don't have or aren't already familiar with. Now, even though I would encourage you to go against stereotypes, there are stereotypes for a reason. While it certainly doesn't apply to all gay men, I have met quite a few who are more effeminate and like to wear makeup. If you're playing up a stereotype for a joke or just to poke fun at a trope, then go for it. Just do be aware that some people are similar to the character you might be creating. This is actually something I see a lot in television and mainstream media. Most shows and entertainment formats tend to stick to a couple of tropes when it comes to representing LGBT characters. For example, lesbians will often be seen as the jean jacket wearing tomboy to contrast the more feminine main characters. Alternatively, you'll see gay men often either having very feminine or very flamboyant personalities, and while this may be true to some extent, it's not as extreme in real life as it would be in television. As I said before, this is usually played for laughs, but if you're going for realism, then I would suggest keeping tropes to a relative minimum. Moving on, we have number 3. Keep it normal. Now, I know I'm not the first one who's said this, but the biggest thing to keep in mind when making LGBT characters is to keep it normal. I know it might seem weird to someone who isn't used to it, but LGBT couples aren't any different from your average couple, with the exception of who has what junk. Speaking from experience, romance is romance no matter what gender someone is. If you're attracted to them, then you're attracted to them. It actually makes me a bit sad that some of my gay friends haven't found partners yet because of how the media used to portray gay relationships, and as a result their families aren't as open about the whole topic. Heck, I was pretty weird about possibly having a relationship with a girl because I simply never had really seen it that much. To use what I would call a good example, there's a show called Modern Family that features a married gay couple, and the only difference I see between these guys and your average couple is that they just both happen to be male. Lastly, number 4 is don't force it. Now this is just speaking from personal experience, but I found that a lot of modern media will sometimes force a character who's LGBT in just for the sake of having them there. While I do feel that representation is important, something to keep in mind is that there's a difference between forced representation and proper representation. Proper representation requires a certain amount of research, especially for writers who may not be as experienced with the LGBT community. Now personally, I don't think that every movie has to have a character who's LGBT in it. I appreciate movies that do it right, but hopefully you guys can understand my level of moderate burnout. Alright, so those are my 4 main points on making LGBT characters. Of course there's more nitty-gritty stuff I could talk about, but I want to diverge from that for a little bit and talk about my experience with the community and share some stuff that I've learned for those who are maybe a little bit unsure about being LGBT. So some of you are probably asking what I identify as, which gets a little confusing because I use Spirit as both a persona to represent myself, but she's also the mascot for my channel. I, the person behind the channel, am bisexual, which essentially means that I find both males and females attractive. I do tend to lean more towards guys when it comes to romance, however there are some girls that I've been romantically attracted to. It's a little hard for me personally to find people I'm attracted to, primarily because it's difficult for me to find people I share similar interests with. Now, Spirit the character is a little bit of a different story. While my main viewership on my channel is within the range of 18 to 24 years old, I have noticed that a lot of my viewership is also under the age of 18. So while I use Spirit as a persona to represent myself, Spirit the character is asexual. This is primarily because of the growing popularity of the character and the fact that a good portion of my viewership is very young. I would much rather not have adult art of her floating around for the sake of my younger audience. So yeah, if for some reason you guys want the do's and don'ts on drawing Spirit, I now have a handy dandy journal on my DA that has all the rules regarding art of her. I've actually noticed that a lot of ace people have really been taking a front seat as of late. For those who are unfamiliar with asexuality, asexuality is basically when you don't really have any sexual feelings towards anyone. I actually thought that I was asexual for a while, but I began to realize as I got older that that simply isn't the case. However, just because you're asexual doesn't make you any lesser than someone who has a different sexuality. I've actually noticed a lot of people will make fun of ace people, and that's really not cool, guys. There's nothing wrong with not having sexual feelings. If anything, it can help you focus on finding a partner that suits you better on a romantic level, instead of just finding someone who's attractive that might be a dick. Really quickly on the topic of Spirit, I've actually gotten a lot of questions as to why she has antlers despite being a girl. Now, since we're talking about Pride Month, there is the topic of people who are transgender. The short answer is that Spirit is not transgender. Sorry to be a disappointment. Back in the day when she was still in her first phase of designing, she was just your average doe. I tossed ideas back and forth what the significance of the antlers actually was, and at one point they were even meant to be similar to a unicorn's horn. But since then they've become more of an aesthetic style to help her stand out a bit. If I do have to assign any meaning to them, it would be that you can still be beautiful no matter what you look like. Now, I do want to talk about pansexuals, as a lot of people will confuse them with bisexuals or polysexuals. Pansexuality means that you're attracted to people regardless of how they look physically. Essentially, you can find anyone attractive as long as they fit your preferences. This includes those who are non-binary, trans, or what have you. Now, polysexuality is something different. From my understanding, polysexuality is when you prefer being in a relationship with multiple people. Now, personally, I don't think I could ever be in a polygamous relationship. From what I've heard, it's pretty difficult, plus I much prefer the one-on-one relationship than having multiple people. However, for anyone who is able to successfully pull off a polygamous relationship, then you have my respect. Heck, if anyone has been able to pull off a polygamous relationship, tell me about it in the comments. I'd be interested to see how you pulled it off. So in terms of my experiences with being LGBT, oh boy. I guess we'll start off with how I figured it out, since that tends to be a bit of a journey for everyone. I remember it was a couple years ago when I was invited to a GSA meeting with my friends. For those who don't know, a GSA is a gay-straight alliance. You'll usually be able to find one in most high schools and colleges. Anyways, we were sitting down at the GSA meeting and doing an activity which essentially explained the different sexualities and orientations that fall under LGBT. Now, at the time I wasn't too familiar with all the sexualities that actually existed, but doing the activity did get me thinking on the topic a little bit. I kind of ho-hummed about the whole topic for a few months, mostly because I was crushing on a guy at the time. However, the summer months started coming around and the girls around me were wearing different clothes and I was like, you know, that's actually kind of attractive. Admittedly, it's a bit hard to explain what it's like not to be straight, but when you realize it, it just sort of clicks. Unfortunately, I wasn't really sure how my family would react. They ended up finding out because I had stuck a pride pin on my birthday wish list, and sadly it didn't go the way that I had hoped. To my luck, they didn't throw me out, but in hindsight I probably should have had a proper sit down and talk with them. Overall, what I have to say is that if you're currently in the closet and want to come out to your family, be sure to sort of plan it out if you can. Especially coming from a relatively conservative family, it can be really hard to come to terms with having a different sexuality, especially if your religion doesn't agree with it. Now, parents, I want to talk to you for a second. One thing that I've noticed can make things difficult for teens to come out of the closet is the things that parents will say regarding the LGBT community. Speaking from experience, my family never really spoke very fondly of LGBT, and while I understand where they were coming from on some of their comments, it caused a lot more unnecessary stress. I think something that everyone should keep in mind is that there's nothing you can do about your sexuality, but we can educate kids about the topic. Heck, I don't care if you're religious, atheist, whatever. If you are a parent and your child has a different sexuality, then it is your responsibility to teach them how to be safe. The last thing I want to address is to anyone who's discovered that they are LGBT. I focus primarily on sexuality as that's what I'm most familiar with, but this goes for gender as well. Regardless if you are gay, straight, bi, trans, whatever, you are important, and you are no less of a person because you are different. Coming from the perspective of someone who has been mostly closeted for almost 2 years, I can't tell you how good it feels to finally have come to terms with being bi. So, as a message from the Blue Deer to you, make sure to have a very happy Pride Month and be who you want to be. And that's about it for this episode. It's a little different from my usual content, but I really wanted to talk about something for Pride Month, as well as give a few words of inspiration to those who might be struggling with questions about their sexuality. So, are you part of the LGBT community, and what are your experiences? Tell me in the comments below. If you guys liked what you saw and want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It supports me and is practically free. Also be sure to check me out on Twitter and DeviantArt, where I post artwork and updates about the show. Want to hang with me on Discord? Well, I am happy to say that I have a server where you can chat with me. Patrons get access to a special rank as well as access to a private channel in the server. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Spirit, and I hope you have a happy Pride Month.